Alrighty. Hi, everybody. This is episode 10 of the Mercuranians Podcast. Thank you guys for tuning in. Today is Sunday, May 22nd at 1:09 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And my name is Cam.
My name is Stella. Today we're going to be talking about the dignity scheme and a lot of the significance that comes with it. Not only just the planetary rulerships, but a lot of the patterns that we see just throughout this beautiful scheme.
hmm Yeah, I think this will be good to kind of go a little bit deeper into what we started setting up talking about last week with just introducing the idea of the zodiac and the signs and, how it
We're
all
two
kind of
weeks
works
ago.
together. Sorry?
2 weeks ago.
Oh, what did we talk about last week?
A philosophy.
Oh, right.
Free
Um,
will.
yeah. Well, anyway, yeah, we'll kind of just be going a little bit deeper with it and really starting to integrate how the planets play more of a role in the scheme of the domicile rulerships.
Yeah, because realistically, like the signs, I don't want to say that they are the planets, but they are like the cousins of the planets, or maybe like the grandchildren of the planets. Like they hold this energy that the planets are actively using. And the
hmm
signs that they rule are going to really embody the energy of that planet, but in two different ways. Are you ready to jump right in?
I think we kind of already are.
Okay. As we were talking about last week or the week before that, with polarity and gender, every planet is going to rule a diurnal and nocturnal sign or a masculine and feminine sign, except for the luminaries.
Yeah, I mean, this is something I always feel like I end up talking about with this because it's like the signs are like, yes, it's another whole classification of how the system works, but really it's like they're just the planetary expressions. Like, I think it's so fundamental to consider how, we have 12 signs and 7 planets, but really they're all just dual expressions of each planetary nature, each of the 7 planetary natures. So, like you did mention, we have the sun and the moon, and as we talked about before, they each have their own singular sign, which is representative of their archetypal energy, the sun being, masculine, fire, the moon being the feminine, the water sign, Cancer. But other than that, as we showed in the scheme, and as you can see, each planet just gets one of each on either side of the luminaries, all the way from Mercury up to Saturn. So you can really almost try to think of the signs as just extensions of the planetary natures themselves.
And I'm sure there's astrologers who would disagree with that, saying, like, no, like signs are still fixed stars, like the fixed stars are like above the planets.
Mhm.
But personally, we maintain the belief that we just shared.
Well, no, I mean, I won't demote any opinion on that level because it's true. The signs reside above the level of the planets, 100%. I I mean, we've mentioned it before, but I think we still want to talk about it more in depthly, like the scheme of the planetary spheres, because that hierarchy of, the levels of divinity of the cosmos around us. The stars are above the motions of the planets, and so the signs as images or constellations or the energies of those archetypes are in some way more divine than the planetary energies, but they're just the dual expressions of the planets.
Right. Exactly.
Mm.
Exactly. Yeah, that makes sense. So, do you want to throw up the graphic and we can talk about that a little bit more? Was there something else you wanted to touch on?
Um, I guess we kind of want to in this episode focus on some of the nuances of the scheme itself and talk about those different relationships of signs by square and by trine and how the planets filter into that. So we won't be discussing them as much yet in the context of rulership in like the natal chart, but we're kind of just getting like deeper into the philosophy behind why are these planets in a square relationship in the domicile scheme, and what does that mean, and what other patterns can we find with that. So that'll kind of be the bigger theme of what we're going to be talking about today.
Yeah, definitely, definitely.
All right, so I'm gonna throw up some of the diagrams that Stella amazingly worked on for the video today.
Thank you. Yeah, it was kind of fun to make them, honestly.
All right, so here we can see the diagram, of the 12 zodiac signs, and inside the wheel, the planetary rulerships. So yeah, Stella, do you want to maybe just summarize a little bit of what we talked about the other week?
Yeah, definitely. So you can see here with this diagram also, if you start at the bottom with Leo and Cancer, those are going to be the luminaries. And you see that there is this symmetry that flanks out from the luminaries going all the way up until Saturn. So we have the moon ruling Cancer, the sun ruling Leo, Mercury rules both Gemini and Virgo, and Venus rules Taurus and Libra, Mars, Aries, and Scorpio, and then Pisces and Sag are ruled by Jupiter, and then Saturn rules Aqua and Cancer, Capricorn. Oh my gosh, Aqua and Capricorn. And something else that this diagram shows is the gender of the sign. And you can see that each planet, aside from the luminaries, has both a diurnal and nocturnal expression, masculine or feminine expression. And by that, it also means that they have a preferred domicile.
Mhm. Right. So if you're looking at the diagram, you can see how every other sign there is going to be a planet that Stella put in red. And these are all of the masculine signs. And adjacent to all of those, we have all of the planets in blue. And those are the earth and water signs, or the feminine signs. So we can see how the principle of the gender of the signs in the zodiac sets up those two main hexagons. So we have the active hexagon, or the solar hexagon, with the sun in Leo kind of being the primary anchor point there. And then, its counterpart, we have the moon in Cancer with all of the other earth and water signs, making that kind of lunar hexagon and establishing the feminine signs. So yeah, this is kind of that base principle that we have, just looking at the alternating gender of each sign. And then, yeah, as Stella mentioned, you can look and see Virgo and Gemini here right next to the luminaries. Mercury in Virgo is blue because it's a feminine sign, it's an earth sign. And then Mercury in Gemini is red because Gemini is an air sign, which is a masculine sign.
And you can glean so much information about like these archetypes and these energies just from looking at different patterns and different symmetries and the opposite of symmetry. And we're going to talk through a lot of that today and like what it really means. There
Mm.
is so much pattern within the zodiac that isn't always super clear. Um,
Yeah, and I think now I'll throw up the next diagram that has everything we've already talked about, in addition to displaying the colors of the elements of the signs. So you can see now the trigons, or the triplicities, which connect, for instance, the sun in Leo, Jupiter in Sagittarius, and Mars in Aries. Um,
yeah.
and
This
also oh, sorry, what were we going to say?
I was gonna say this diagram can seem very busy at first. Just like pick it apart piece by piece because I know there's a bunch of different colors on there, but there is pattern to it.
Yeah, totally. And then the final, division, which would be by four, we see the quadruplicities in here, with denoted by the different letters: C for a cardinal sign, F for the fixed sign, and then M for the mutable sign.
Yeah, definitely. Um, do you want to jump right into some of these patterns?
Yeah,
Or
sure.
I feel like we could kind of steep on something else for a little while, like the planets and their preferred domiciles.
Yeah, sure. Why don't we talk about that? Because we've been talking about yeah, the sign gender here. So let me throw that up, and then we'll come back to that one that we were just looking at.
Mm-hmm. So you can see here that there are preferred domiciles for each of the planets, and that depends on the sect of the planet. We talked about that in one of our earlier episodes, but for example, Mars prefers Scorpio to Aries because Mars is a nocturnal planet. It will do better in the cool and moist environment that comes with Scorpio than in the hot and dry environment that comes with Aries. And
Mhm.
because Mars is a malefic, Mars and Aries can be very active.
Right. So that Aryan, fiery, dry, hot nature is going to exacerbate some of the more malefic qualities that Mars has because, like we talked about in the episode on sect, the malefics like to be where they are because that sect somehow tempers or moderates their nature.
Yes.
Mars being extremely hot and dry gets cooled off and tempered in the nocturnal sect. Same thing with Saturn, that cold and dim and dry planet gets warmed up a little bit by being, preferring the diurnal sect. So we see that same pattern here where out of their two domiciles, one being masculine, one being feminine, they're going to prefer or somehow express their nature more balanced or in a more, you know,
Comfortable.
comfortable way. Yeah.
Yeah.
In one of these preferred domiciles where the gender matches with the sect of the planet.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what dignity is all about. Like, how comfortable is this planet where it is in this sign? And like when you get into smaller dignities and stuff like that, like there's a lot of different factors that go into it.
Mhm.
But when we're talking about planets and signs, it's really a matter of comfort. The ancients will use like the analogy of like a homeland and stuff like that. So you can imagine that like a planet in its own domicile has all of the resources it needs and knows where to find them.
Mhm. Yeah, and something interesting that occurred to me looking at this idea of the preferred domicile is so when we look at the aspects from planets of the same sect from their preferred domiciles, for instance, when we look at the moon in Cancer, we know that's the moon's only domicile. Its aspect to Venus in Taurus is a sextile, and Venus prefers her domicile in Taurus. And in addition, she's more beneficially configured to the moon, which is the sect leader of the nocturnal planets. So the moon is the leader of Venus and Mars, is configured by a comfortable sextile to Venus and Taurus, whereas in Libra, it's configured by a square, which is a little bit more of a contentious relationship. Then if you look at the moon's configuration to Mars's domiciles, Mars makes a trine to the moon in Cancer from Scorpio. So Mars's preferred domicile is also in a beneficial or harmonious configuration to its sect leader, the moon in Cancer. And we can see the same thing here with Venus, or I'm sorry, with Mars in Aries, configured by square to the moon in Cancer as well.
Yeah, that's very true. And is that
Yeah, even
same?
yeah, for the diurnal sect as well. I mean, Saturn's configured by an opposition to the sun in Leo in his preferred domicile in Aquarius, whereas in his domicile in Capricorn, it's unconfigured to the sun in Leo. And we see
Mhm.
the same thing with Jupiter, where we see a trine configuration from Sagittarius to Leo versus the aversion from Pisces to Leo um, for Jupiter's nocturnal domicile. And that's interesting that there's still symmetry on both ends because with the nocturnal planets, we see this sextile trine back and forth, but then with the diurnal planets here, we see this relationship between the opposition in the trine and the aversion to the domiciles that aren't preferred instead of the square to the domiciles that are preferred
Yeah.
with the nocturnal planets. So that's interesting as well.
And another really fascinating aspect of the way that they're configured is that they both make a wedge. When we get to talking about the exaltation scheme, that symmetry isn't totally maintained, but with the domicile scheme and the planets in their preferred domiciles, they each make a wedge. And it's really telling to see the relationship between the opposed planets in that wedge. And I like to imagine the planet making the sextile and the trine to be kind of like a mediator between the two, where we have the moon kind of balancing out between Mars and Venus. And the moon is closer to Venus because there's a bit more agreement between the moon and Venus than the moon and Mars. And so
Mhm.
it's easier for the moon to be so close to Venus and working with Venus in that way. If that makes sense, that last part.
Right.
Uh,
And as we explore a lot more of these different kind of patterns and encoded themes in Hellenistic astrology, one of them is going to be the relationship of the sextile and the trine aspects, which are 60 and 120 degrees of separation between the planets. And what we see here in the domicile scheme is that each of the sect leaders, um, you know, the moon, for instance, in Cancer is making a sextile to Venus in her preferred domicile in Taurus, whereas the sun is making a trine to Jupiter's preferred domicile in Sagittarius. So both of the sect leaders, the sect lights, make the aspect to the preferred domicile of the benefic of their sect in accordance with that pattern, where we see the repetition of the sextile coming between planets that are related in the nocturnal sect, and then the trine between planets that are related in the diurnal sect. And that pattern is so significant because that's going to show up when we talk about planetary joys, exaltations, triplicity lords. That theme is fundamental to connecting a lot of different really um, really fundamental concepts in Hellenistic astrology.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And with that diurnal team, you can see that like well, so they are wedged. I don't think I really explicitly said what a wedge was. A wedge is going to be an opposition, and then there's going to be an apex point, which is a third planet. And that apex point, that third planet, is going to be sextiled to one of the planets in opposition and trined to another one in opposition. So you're going to have this like off balance triangle that looks like a wedge. And it's super significant that the sun and Leo are opposed while Venus and Mars are opposed. That shows to that like discordance that you get between those two planets and how they tend to disagree and come from like opposite ends.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of interesting wedge configurations on the whole wheel, like thinking about, so like, okay, the sun, Saturn opposition in Aquileo, and then Jupiter wedging that from Sagittarius. I mean, that's a really interesting one because it's kind of combining all of the planets in their most powerful, all of the diurnal planets in their most powerful domiciles. But like also an interesting one to think about would be like the Venus and Taurus opposite Mars and Scorpio, and then Mercury and Virgo being a wedge to that configuration, because in this case, Mercury is kind of acting as a conduit that balances and relates, Venus and Taurus's energy in a really harmonious way, and is able to translate that a little bit into the energy of Mars and Scorpio and mediate that. So I think it might speak to Mercury's power in Virgo, and that somehow, his configuration to those two planets, when he's considered in a nocturnal lens, which also is something that we haven't addressed here, because if you look in Mercury's domiciles, we wrote the letter N there, which is a little bit maybe controversial. It's something that there's been a little bit more like discussion about on like Astro Twitter recently, because Mercury's role in astrology, as we've talked about over and over and over again, is vacillation and neutrality. And so Mercury, in a way, while yes, there might be really minor differences in the dignity when you break it down to the bounds and the decans and the dodecatemori, and you can look at all of Mercury's strength in a sign, and it might be stronger in Virgo for whatever reason. But some people argue his preferred domicile is Virgo, but other people are now considering the idea that Mercury, based off of his phase or his basic sect relationship in the chart, will make him prefer Gemini as a morning star, or prefer Virgo as an evening star.
Right, right. And we also have that same wedge with Mercury, the Sun, and Saturn, where Mercury can kind of act as a mediator between the two. And that's something that you really want with your planets of the same sect, is for
Mhm.
them to be communicating.
Mhm.
And if you have the Sun in Leo and then you have Mercury in Gemini, Mercury is going to be a morning star. It's going to be rising above the
Oh, I'm sorry. Mercury, he could be in Cancer.
Oh my God, you're so right.
No, but you were so right for giving that example of what a morning star is. So you were right. I just didn't. Oh,
Thanks. Yeah, no, let me reset.
but I loved everything you were saying. That wedge is also interesting. We can talk more about that wedge
Uh-huh.
too.
I'll start from there.
Okay.
Um So we have that same wedge also with the Sun, Mercury, and Saturn. And you can see that there is communication and relationship between at least those three signs. And generally, you want planets of the same sect to be aspecting one another. And that just will help things communicate and will help them bring about their planetary desires. And so when we have a scheme where we have like a planet wedging and kind of moderating an opposition and helping bridge some communication between those two planets, you can see that energy also come through with that wedged apex planet.
So another interesting wedge we could look at is Mercury in Gemini's opposition to Jupiter in Sagittarius, with the Sun in Leo, wedging that opposition by a sextile to Mercury in Gemini and a trine to Jupiter in Sag. And an interesting thing that we can also take into account when we're looking at these aspect patterns is in which directions is the energy flowing in that aspectual relationship or in that testimonial relationship between the planets. So for instance, Mercury in Gemini, because Gemini becomes earlier in zodiacal order than Leo, Mercury is sending that aspect ray visually forward. They had this whole concept of how the planets were seeing each other by aspect. And so even
That's
though this,
part of the etymology of the word aspect
right,
is
I'd
sight.
speak array to see.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Mhm.
Um, and so when we consider that in this rationale, Mercury in Gemini is somehow sending that sextile to the sun. So the sun receives this informational inspiration or this knowledge, which then illuminates Jupiter in Sagittarius through an overcoming trine. Um, and, another thing about this too is Mercury's domiciles are adjacent to the sun and the moon because we know that Mercury doesn't actually get very far away from the sun. He's kind of like tethered to the sun, like a dog on a leash in a kind of a funny way.
And that's also part of the reason why Virgo is said to be Mercury's exaltation, because you really can't have Mercury like a sextile away from the sun. So that's the most realistic version,
Mm.
but it's still super significant.
Right. Yeah. I think as we're talking now, like symbolically, like we can't not address the fact that Gemini is sextile to Leo. So like,
Yeah.
yes, these planets literally cannot be configured in a sextile. They couldn't actually even be in a whole sign sextile because Mercury can only be 28 degrees away from the sun. So you couldn't even get it, close, just barely off of the sign boundaries. But anyway, when we're talking about these aspects here, like for instance, in this wedge, the between Mercury and Gemini opposing Jupiter and Sagittarius, with the sun in Leo, wedging them by a sextile to Mercury and a trine to Jupiter. When we talk about that relationship, like obviously Mercury can't really be configured like that, but there's something still symbolic here that we're going to be kind of honing in on understanding, especially when it comes into the idea of testimony in aspectual relationships. So all of the planets, for instance, Mercury and Gemini, they send their visual rays or their aspect rays um, forward in zodiacal motion. So Mercury and Gemini
And
would send a visual ray to see the sun in Leo, which we know he can't see the sun 60 degrees ahead, but we're just talking symbolically. Mercury somehow is going to send that information, right? It's Gemini, which is going to give the sun this, concept of awareness or of revelation about some insight, and then the sun sends that overcoming trine or the superior trine over ahead to Jupiter. And so that kind of brings in this whole idea of, the base bone of Sagittarian energy is the super strong overcoming trine from Leo. And so there's like this continual illumination and like knowledge and like foresight and like awareness of light and life that Sagittarius is just continually being over flooded by from that overcoming trine from Leo.
yeah, yeah. And that has to do with the Sagittarian quest for knowledge
Mm.
and like just being chasing the sun. Like
Mm.
I have described my very, very, very Sagittarian mother that way, that she loves to chase the sun. And it's just it makes sense.
Mhm.
And it really, you can look at all of these configurations and understand like the archetypes that come with the signs
Mhm.
from a technical perspective too, because it
Right.
can be interesting to hear these like really abstract things like, oh, like Aries is a go-getter, like they're headstrong, like they want to do things like their way. Well, look at how Mars, Mercury, I'm sorry, Aries, Gemini, and the Sun are configured here. Like you can see why that might be such headstrong energy with a planet like Mars being very active and being very I don't want to say aggressive, but active. Can you just cut that
Yeah.
out?
I mean, I was oh, yeah.
Or what were you gonna say?
Well, I mean, I think when I look at Mars and Aries, it's getting an overcoming trine or a superior trine from Jupiter and Sag. So it's getting all this boost in confidence and honor and like this, pridefulness that is so inherent to the area nature that comes from that forward overcoming trine from Jupiter and Sag in that way.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And that can be sextiled to Mercury,
Mhm.
which is going to create like a big speaker, someone whose voice just really commands a room, like you know their presence when they're
Mhm.
there. And
Right.
then on the nocturnal side of that, like if you had a person who had that wedge between like Venus, Mars, and Mercury, like you might have like somebody who is a great like genuinely like mediator. Like I
Mhm.
know that that gets put on Libra a lot of the time, and that still holds true. But if you have that aspect between Venus and Mars, I feel like when you have conflict and differing opinions, if you have that Mercury there, it allows someone to really reflect and analyze that and understand that. And that
Mhm.
speaks on the nature of Virgo, especially, where Virgos love to analyze, they love to find the details, and they want to help and make things better. They want to make things right.
Mhm.
And for maybe a Martian, that might not be so enjoyable, where they're like, it doesn't need to be perfect. It doesn't need to be right. You get what I said.
Mhm.
And for a Venusian, it might be like kind of both. Like, oh, don't take the fun out of it. Like just enjoy it. Like happy accidents. But with
Yeah.
Mercury there, like that kind of, it makes this very great like moderation and this like balance between those energies.
Mhm. Um, like for instance, looking at the moon in Cancer being overcome by the trine from Jupiter and Pisces, I think speaks to Cancerian energies, desire to just seek the comfort and peace and containment of feeling so emotionally overwhelmed and stimulated by searching for that really benefic energy that comes from, Pisces being the domicile of Jupiter and the exaltation of Venus, which represents Pisces being, the highest expression of pleasurable energy in a way, and somehow Cancer being, striving to have that kind of infused into its environment by that overcoming trine from Jupiter and Pisces. You know,
Right. Oh, I'm sorry.
I was gonna just talk about Cap and Virgo, and
Oh,
then
I was gonna build on that a little bit more with
okay, then you
Mars.
build.
And if we look at that trine to Mars too, that the moon in Cancer makes, that
Mhm.
also kind of speaks to that crabby ass energy you get with Cancers, where they can be pretty like volatile. And
Mhm.
that's the moon sending that trine to that Mars and Scorpio like domicile. And
Mhm.
so, like, something that I just really want to emphasize, and like we're going to continue to emphasize, is that the zodiac talks to itself. These are not like independent signs. And I
Mhm.
think that the idea of independence in astrology trips up a lot of people. Like it can kind of keep you from getting like immersed in the whole picture, when a lot of the time you really do need to be immersed in the whole picture.
Mhm. Yeah,
Because I mean, you don't have to, but it'll tell you so much. Like, don't you want to be?
I know. Yeah, I mean, it's like we've said, it's a fractal, so it's gonna be completely self-reliant on just expounding upon its own information 5,000 fold. It's like we can just keep going.
Right.
Um, so like another one is that's interesting to me is like Mercury in Virgo overcoming a trine to Saturn in Capricorn. So Saturn and the Capricornian energy being having that internal motivation to have something be practical and have it be organized. And then what does Capricorn do? Well, the Capricorn's overcoming trine goes into Venus and Taurus. So it's like it wants to bring things in from practicality and then bring it into manifestation, into physicality with the Taurian energy. So Capricorn is that mediating point between, having the balance come in to have it make sense and be neat and have a purpose, and then to bring it physically into, manifestation, which is like that forward trine to Venus and Taurus.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that this is like a great segue into, I mean, did you want to keep talking about this more?
I mean, we're kind of already talking about so many different themes, I feel like, because as we're talking about these trines, in a way we're referencing the whole concept of the elements and triplicity, because when we're talking about a trigon, we're speaking specifically about that elemental configuration. So in that last case, that was all about how the earth signs are interacting. And then when we talked about Pisces, Cancer, and Scorpio, we were all talking about the water trigon. So in a way, we're kind of already talking about how the triplicities or the elements are all interact with each other here as well. But yeah.
Yeah, well, I was just going to take what you said about that Capricorn energy
Mhm.
and like talk about cardinality and the
Yeah.
significance of that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Here, why
I'll
don't I bring up the other
break this.
diagram that has the modalities written on it?
Okay. And
So
with that example of with Mercury, Saturn, and Venus, you also see like this beautiful like example of the modality where you have mutable Mercury in Virgo conjuring the idea, sending the trine to Saturn in the cardinal sign of Capricorn, which is going to make things happen. Cardinal energy is active, it's the hinge, it's the change that's occurring.
mhm.
And then that trine
Also,
getting
sorry,
sent.
just it's so interesting you use the word hinge for the cardinal sign, because the angles of the chart, which is something different, but the angular houses were called the hinges, or the pivot points. And so it's interesting that the cardinal nature somehow, is there's a sympathy between that and the cardinal energy too.
It does. I'm almost positive that cardinality, like cardinal, has like roots with the word hinge and like translations of that. I'm like
Mm,
almost 100% positive,
yeah,
but I'm not.
cardo. Trying to think of the root, but we'll figure that out. We'll get back to the etymology on that.
Yeah. Um, and then Saturn sending that trine down to a fixed Venus in Taurus, and that fixed energy is going to follow through.
Mhm,
It's going to do the completion. It's going to materialize it.
mhm,
And you can see that with like multiple different like mutable, cardinal, and fixed energies. Like let's
mhm.
take a look at the fire trine where we
Can I say
have,
one more thing about the Earth trigon?
of
Because the,
course.
the final leg will just be Venus in Taurus sending the trine forward to Mercury in Virgo. And so that idea of just the principle of manifestation and physicality somehow inspiring a need for it to be organized, like that connection speaks to like the organizational principle like of reality, I feel like that somehow, and especially with the moon being the apex of the minor grand trine, which is just the moon being in two different sextiles or in between at the midpoint of the trine, the moon being representative of, the physical world. It's like the physical etheric layer that surrounds the planet, or the planetary sphere of the moon, this idea that in physicality, there's this nature between, materialization itself and somehow nature having this internal processing system to make everything organized and pattern. And I think it speaks to this kind of Taurus, Cancer, Virgo connection here, where we see the moon as the apex, anchoring that organizational principle of physical material reality from that base point of the moon in Cancer.
Right, exactly. It's called the Fibonacci sequence, right? The golden.
Yeah, that's one name for, I mean, there's so many amazing natural mathematical patterns, but that's like
Right.
the
That
ultimate
was,
one, the golden
yeah.
ratio. Yeah.
Uh-huh. So, and I think that that is so fascinating because not only is it for, it's a little bit too big to bite into today to explain exactly what the Fibonacci sequence is, but it's basically like everywhere in nature it can be found. It's super interesting. If you don't know about it, look it up. But it's like gorgeous. It is very visually appealing. It is so organized. And the fact that it's everywhere like really makes you feel like
Mhm.
everything around you is alive in a
Yeah.
way. Because if it's in like a tree and it's in a leaf, and then it's like in what, like our
Conch
cells?
shells and hurricanes and
Yeah.
sunflowers and pine cones, and it's everywhere.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's literally everywhere.
Mhm.
And so that minor grand trine, I feel like also really delivers that too, because it's not only
Totally.
like perfect, but
Mhm.
it's beautiful. And with the moon, it's everywhere.
Yeah. Like it might even be a stretch to say it, but like honestly, Fibonacci is kind of like the analog of astrology on Earth. Like there is a principle, like a mathematical organizational principle that exists through the encoding of how things in nature is programmed, to create itself visually that we see replicated in the stars fractally through astrology as well. So I think there's a huge connection there between the golden ratio and astrology for sure.
I agree. And this is a small digression, but if you take a look at how, like, even our planets travel through our solar system, like
Mhm.
as a whole, and like with our solar system moving, like
Mhm.
I don't have enough foundation to say that it matches the Fibonacci sequence. I don't quite think it does, but maybe over time it will, you
It
know?
replicates the spiral pattern
It
100%. And
yeah,
if anything, the arms of the Milky Way galaxy do. So you can keep going higher and
yeah,
higher.
yeah. Well,
Yeah.
and this is a big digression, but this was something that I wanted to say in our last episode, was that
Yeah.
I feel like you can zoom in on atoms and you could find the same kind of patterns that we see in astrology, like with atomic movement. You could zoom out on our galaxies and see those same kinds of patterns and themes showing up in whole solar systems and stuff
Right.
like that.
Yeah.
So I just really think that it's very fractal, but
Yeah. As above, so below.
yes.
Yeah. Um, so did you want to start talking about, we've talked a bit about the trigons. Do you want to expound on any more storytelling with the trigons? Do you see anything else you want to talk about, or do you want to, because we have a lot to say about the modalities or the quadruplicities as well. So
Yeah, so we have, I mean, I think that a lot of what we said about the trigons, yes, we did not cover everything
mhm,
in there, but we covered all of the major points that can be applied
mhm.
to the different parts, like
Yeah,
between.
maybe we'll do a future episode doing all of that kind of storytelling and going into the more specifics with each of the
Yeah,
signs.
definitely. Let us know in the comments if that's
Yeah,
something you'd want to hear.
there is one
Um,
more before we do the modalities.
Shoot.
Okay, so, and this will be quick because it's just the inverse analog to the minor grand trine of the moon in Cancer we were just looking at. And it's the sun in Leo being the midpoint between the Gemini Libra trine. And that somehow this human relational principle through the awakening of our consciousness and in the engagement socially of our soul with other people, I think somehow speaks to, okay, there's this natural pattern that the moon in Cancer anchors to, the materialization of physical reality in this beautiful way around us in nature. And then the sun in Leo somehow speaking to the human social dynamic that we have, the exchanges we have with other people, and that brings about the illumination of our consciousness through learning, so through Mercury and Gemini, to also our human connections and friendships and intimate relationships with other people, and that somehow the balance of knowledge and relationships both contribute to the illumination of our consciousness of our soul, are the sun in Leo.
Exactly, and kind of tying in the whole idea of like nature and the Fibonacci sequence, um, we have we you can't have the Fibonacci sequence if you don't have the sun to give
Mhm.
life to Earth, and you can't recognize its significance and prevalence if you don't have Mercury, you
Mhm.
know? So it all goes together. And this also ties in with the difference between diurnal and nocturnal energies, masculine and feminine energies, where
Mhm.
one is very active and one is very much like, let's do it, let's fuel it. And then
Mhm.
the other one is very observant and very much I don't want to say go with the flow entirely, but like follow your intuition, follow your soul
Mhm.
versus like following your head.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so,
There's one more I would love to talk about, but we'll just keep going along because
okay.
like Jupiter and Sag, that minor grand trine is, I think, fascinating. But
With Jupiter, Mars, and Saturn.
Jupiter, Venus in Libra, and Saturn in Aquarius.
Oh, yeah, I agree. I think that is we could talk about
I
that for
know,
the entire
I
zodiac.
know.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
But we'll move into the modalities if you're ready.
Yeah,
Okay.
definitely. Something else that I think is really, really fascinating is that Venus and Mars, they are adverse one another. The only time that they see each other with their signs is going to be when they're opposed, but there is no agreement and they do not relate to each other.
Mhm.
Venus and Mars as planets, both of Venus's signs are adverse each other, even. So we have Venus and Taurus adverse Venus and Libra. We have Mars and Scorpio adverse Aries and Mars in Aries.
Mhm. And so, yeah, and so I mean, the other thing, I mean, there's a lot of things to say about the Venus Mars connection in the zodiac. But one of the things that I thought of here in relationship to the preferred domiciles is that, Taurus and Scorpio, that opposition, those at least domicile or take the home of the planets in the sign gender that they'd prefer. Whereas
Mhm.
Aries Libra, they're both getting intensified and becoming more active and quick as nocturnal planets, which they don't prefer as much. So there's some nature to the Taurus Scorpio axis that, overall is going to be a little bit more tempered or at home, for the planets like we talked about.
Right, exactly. And like with the luminaries, the sun being exalted in Aries and the moon being exalted in Taurus, with the
Hmm.
moon being fallen in Scorpio and the sun being
Hmm.
fallen in Libra.
Hmm.
And you also kind of have that symmetry when you're taking a look at the luminaries versus Saturn, where, well, do you want to steep on the idea of the luminaries having domicile in both Cancer and Leo?
Oh yeah.
Okay. So it has been a recent kind of topic where people are considering the luminaries also at home in, so like the moon having domicile in both Cancer and Leo, with of course the preferred being Cancer. The
Oh,
sun,
well, I was gonna say I wouldn't call it domicile, but I would definitely say it's a sympathy that is significant.
okay. And I agree with that. I think
Mm,
it's a very significant sympathy, but I also agree. I would not go as far as to say it's domiciled.
yeah. I mean, it's like they stand on their own, so there's a connection. It's almost like like they're luminary signs, so they're different. So the moon in Leo or the sun in Cancer, there's an intrinsic relationship where, they have to listen to the other one. They're already set apart because they're their own unique duo. So we can't not address the fact that there's a sympathy between, those planets being in each other's signs.
Right. And like when Saturn gets to be the odd one out and have like two consecutive signs next to each other, like
Mm,
it kind of makes you like wonder, like, oh, that would make sense with the
mhm,
luminaries because
right.
like sure they stand alone, but
Mhm,
they might be very agreeable, in these signs.
mhm. And it speaks to, any planets you have there. So if you have planets in Cancer and Leo, there's an intrinsic connection there. And even if you don't, there's a connection between those two houses in your chart. Same thing with Capricorn and Aqua. Even though they're adverse to each other, same thing with Cancer and Leo, even though they can't traditionally see each other by aspect, there's a sympathy that connects the topics there because Saturn, for instance, is responsible for providing for both of those places next to each other. So whatever houses that you have, Capricorn and Aquarius fall into, Saturn has to provide for those places and so automatically connects those things and those themes in your life. And so the other thing with Mercury and Venus's signs is that between their domiciles of Aries, Taurus, Libra, and Scorpio, we have one sign of each of the four elements. So that's really interesting because Then when we look at the luminary Saturn axis, so Cancer, Leo, and Capricorn, Aquarius, we also see all four elements. Cancer's water, Leo's fire, Cap is earth, and Aqua is air. So that leaves us with four more signs. So we've had this pattern where we have like two signs adjacent in oppositions, two other signs adjacent in oppositions, and then boom, we get four more signs that are equally square and apart from each other. And once again, we see in this case, these are the domiciles of Mercury and Jupiter. And once again, we have each one of the four elements. And this is
Yes.
significant because it's going to connect it to the modalities, which all each contain one sign, one sign of each of the four elements.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. That was beautifully said. And so this relationship that we have between Jupiter and Mercury is very, very unique. Like when you ignore what's going on or put on the back burner what's going on with the luminaries Saturn and then Venus and Mars, you get that like perfect square. And that's going to be a grand cross. For anyone who may not know, if you have four squares that connect, there will be two oppositions in the middle, and that is called a grand cross, the aspect configuration. And Jupiter and Mercury have such a fascinating relationship because, I mean, from what I've seen in a majority of the charts that I have looked at and stuff like that, they're not like miserable in their fall. And I mean, no planet is, but it's so fascinating how Jupiterian energy can take a mercurial twist, and mercurial energy can definitely take a Jupiterian twist while
Mhm,
still holding on to its essence.
mhm. Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of like domicile rulership, a planet in detriment will struggle to manifest the topics of the life in that house that it's ruling. But as you're saying, in terms of like the mercurial essence of your soul and that archetypal energy in you, um, you know, how many Mercury Sag people do you think of that in some way the principle of Mercury is like lessened somehow? Like they are the biggest thinkers and talkers and communicators. And, it's like, so there's this idea that, that placement is somehow debilitating the quality of the planet itself and how we express it archetypally in our personality. I wouldn't honestly agree with that either. So I agree with you.
Yes, yes. And it's still so just like powerful.
Mhm,
And that's something that's very unique. Like when you have these squares between the four mutable signs, we've got this Mercury Sag opposition and the Virgo Pisces opposition. Do you want to talk a little bit about accuracy versus precision?
Oh yeah. So when we were kind of brainstorming, what to talk about in this episode, I had this random memory from like my chemistry class where our teacher was teaching us about like how to perform like well reputable, like how to produce good data in a lab experiment basically. And it comes down to having two different factors. It's about having both accuracy and precision because they're two different things. And the analogy of what those qualities are were demonstrated through this analogy of using a target through in archery. So precision is really about the consistency and replication of data over multiple experiments. So when we look at these targets here, the two targets on the left-hand side, um, both have precise results, which means if you're obtaining a specific like data point, you're replicating it and reaching the same area.
Precision has a lot to do with consistency. Like,
Mhm.
can I hit the mark over and over and over again? Can I
Right.
start with A? Can I hit A again?
hmm And then with the idea of accuracy, that's more about like, are you on target in your replication of your results? So like, are you finding what you're looking for and getting results consistently? So this is where we see the combination of both of these ideas coming together as not just being about, having an idea for something, right? Having a goal in mind that's being accurate, but then having the consistency to bring it about multiple times is the precision. And so we kind of constructed this analogy from this idea of accuracy and precision that might exemplify some of the qualities of the four mutable signs, which we found kind of interesting to kind of toy around with this idea that we think kind of exemplifies some interesting qualities of the sign. So we kind of settled on this idea that Virgo is this magical place where Mercury is able to exemplify the accuracy principle and the precision
Well,
principle.
I would like to say that Virgo likes to aim for both accuracy and precision.
Hmm.
And they like to do that consistently. Like, really, really strong Virgoan energy is going to want to have accuracy and precision in as many places as they can.
Hmm. Yeah. Um, and so the other sign that we see as accurate is actually Sagittarius. So what Sag and Virgo have in common is that they have an end goal in mind. Like they're looking for, like they have their hypothesis stated, in the
Right.
lab analogy here. The difference is that Virgo is getting all the measurements right in the test tubes and replicating it. Sag might be messing up some of the details with it, but like they're still like they know what they're doing in the experiment. Okay. Whereas when we
Right.
look at the other two signs which are lacking accuracy, it's Gemini and Pisces. And so in some way, they're not paying attention to the instructions. They're not grasping the end goal or result of what they're trying to get. But Gemini has the precision of Mercury. So really what we found is that Mercury is kind of like the precision principle. So Gemini now, even though we, or I won't restate that. Gemini retains the precision of Mercury, that in some way Pisces is lacking, because when it comes down to it, it seems like there's this element of Pisces that is losing precision and accuracy because it
Right.
is debilitating Mercury, and so it's losing that organizational principle that Virgo retains so well.
Right. And let's stir on that a little bit, because what we have here, like building on the lab analogy, we have a Gemini who might skim through the directions, doesn't really have an end goal in sight, and can replicate their results
Yes.
multiple times,
Mhm.
even if their results are just a little bit wrong.
Yeah.
Like their final end is like a little bit different than what you were supposed to get. Whereas like Pisces are like, I don't really care what the lab says. Like, I think this is cool. Like, I'm just gonna do what I want here. Like,
Yeah.
like I'm
As a
gonna
heavy Gemini person that did labs, like that was so accurate. Like I was not paying attention when the teacher was lecturing about the lab, but I would speed through the instructions and then just get right to work on the lab and like kind of just be weaseling my way through it, but like not really getting the best results, but like kind of botching it. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Uh-huh. Well, and something super funny with like my Pisces Venus is that
Mhm.
like I was 100% exactly like that. At the end of experiments with all of the leftover stuff, I 110% messed around with it. I would mix things that like I wasn't supposed to. Like I would be weighing stuff and like just like
I
messing
just give the
around.
biggest apology to all my past science teachers because I'll say my Pisces moon is guilty as well. It
Yeah.
definitely causes the distraction that gets Gemini to lose its focus. Like that, like if we want to go back to the Themamundi or just the domicile, like that square between Gemini and Pisces can be so antagonistic to like the mind. Like Pisces just obliterates the Mercurial and Gemini principle of like focus and learn and study. And Pisces is like, get out of here, go daydream.
I know. And it's like, oh, here's this like new topic you've learned about. Like, we're gonna take this idea and we're gonna fucking run with it in our minds. Like,
Mhm.
we're gonna think about all of the different ways that this fits in. Whereas, like, Virgo and energy is very much like, oh, I can add this to my perfectly organized like thought process already. Like,
Yeah.
this is just another piece to the puzzle. And
Mhm.
of course, there are many, many, many things in the chart that will make these less generalizable. But
Mhm.
we're talking about the archetype here
Right.
specifically.
Of course.
Yeah. And
Um,
so, another analogy that I like to use, if the accuracy versus precision is kind of tripping anyone up, imagine the four mutable signs and they are stuck in the woods, right? Let's start with like just being in the middle of the forest, all right? someone's like, we need to get to a cave. I feel like that person is going to be Sag. Like Sag is like, we need to get to a cave and I'm going to lead the way there. So Virgo is like, okay, we need to get to the cave. I'm going to be picking berries
I
on the way
was
up to the cave. Yeah, so that we have food. I'm going to be trying to find like leaves that we can use for toilet paper. Like, what do we need? How can I help? Gemini and Pisces, on the other hand, Gemini is gonna be like, oh, like look at this mushroom. Oh my gosh, like look at this tree. And like they might be kind of more like adventurous, but then like Gemini might be the one who finds like a huge thing of like blueberries or whatever. I know that blueberries don't really grow in the wild, but go with it. And
some
then
do.
right,
Maybe,
yeah,
maybe.
yeah, yeah, sometimes it's dangerous though. Anyways, um Pisces, however, is like picking berries and like
And
eating
just
them
eating them
on the
along the way.
yes, on the way up. Pisces is like, wow, like I've never been able to see the stars like this
Oh, look at this little
before.
stream, and there's these
Yeah.
fishies.
Yeah.
Right. Like
And like
just it's losing the accuracy and the precision, you know.
uh-huh. And like Sag is still just like trudging, like marching up ahead,
Right.
like I have that end goal in sight. I need to get there.
Yeah, and
So
Sag will like take like a way more like wonky path to get to the cave than it needs to, because Virgo will be like, well, wait, if we follow that trail, like it looks like it goes straight up, and Sag is like, no, 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 I know where I'm going. Like, and it
yeah.
takes a super roundabout way.
Well, and then like Gemini and Pisces were the ones who climbed the tree and like pointed out the trail to Virgo, and they
Mm,
were like, "Hey, look at this." And then like Sag just didn't care.
yeah,
Yeah. So you can kind of get the energy that comes with it. I think the mutable signs can be very fun.
yeah. I love that it's just Mercury and Jupiter, you know, like they're just reserved for that mutable energy.
Yeah, and
It's fascinating.
this really gives this like beautiful idea of like knowledge and wisdom, and
Right.
like knowledge versus and like knowing versus like learning and teaching versus learning, stuff like that. And
Hmm.
that's that kind of energy that's carried by like Jupiter versus Virgo. Whereas like Jupiter might want to teach even if they're not very qualified to. And
Mm,
like Virgo might want to learn, or Mercury might want to learn, but have like no true Gemini might have no true direction.
mm,
And so that's one of the things about Virgo and why Mercury might be exalted in Virgo is
yeah.
because it does have both of those things. It has
Hmm.
that end goal in sight. And I don't want it to seem like we're like bashing on Pisces at all. Like
I
I
know.
love Pisces. Like
I love Pisces.
Pisces are creative geniuses.
Mhm.
But
In addition to 100 other things.
yeah, exactly. And arguably some of the biggest charmers of the zodiac. Um, but yeah, you can definitely see how these archetypes of Mercury and Jupiter and like why there's some tension between them too.
Mhm.
But also the fact that it's because it's so mutable and so adaptable, and learning and experience is the end goal for both of them.
Mhm.
They're a good middle ground. And
Right.
that's why the planetary archetypes we feel like remain so grounded even when they're fallen or debilitated.
Yeah. I think the other thing about Mercury Virgo too is like because Mercury just moves so much, like we always talk about how like the malefics are tempered by being in that opposite environment. Mercury in some way gets stability in an earth sign in Virgo and allows it to be, you know, move and trailblaze ahead on one path. So there's this strength that Mercury gets in Virgo just by it being earth, you know, it's like it can stay on track.
Yes, yes, 100%.
Hmm.
And like when you think about the myth of Icarus, like flying too close to the sun, I
Hmm.
feel like that is something that can happen with Mercury and Gemini, or honestly, like Mercury and air signs, where it's just like this like constant like consumption of knowledge to the point of where like you can burn yourself out, like fly
Hmm.
too close to the sun,
Right.
or kind of lose your foundation. Like you have all of this knowledge, but no cohesive story with it, you
Mhm.
know?
Yeah, I think it's also the whole idea of losing the end goal, or the sight
Mhm.
of, the light at the end of the tunnel. And in that way, that's the Gemini Pisces connection,
Right.
where they lose the accuracy. This diagram we're using here, we are taking from sciencenotes.org. So thank you very much, Science Notes. We give all credits to them for this great
Yes.
diagram.
Uh-huh, and we picked this one especially because it's a square between the 4 signs, like,
Right. And you
and
can see the
exactly
Virgo
they are.
Pisces opposition from top
Uh-huh.
left to bottom right, and then Sag Gemini here.
Mhm.
But the other idea we can kind of qualify that idea of accuracy with the mutable signs is that we saw that Mercury retained the precision principle, but Jupiter wasn't purely accurate, because the accurate signs were Sag and Virgo, and the ones that lost accuracy were Pisces and Gemini. And so what we actually see symmetrically is we can use the principle of solar and lunar signs, which is different slightly than the gender of the sign. So the solar signs are encompassed by the 6 signs of the zodiac that are in the hemisphere from Leo to Capricorn. So if we imagine a symmetrical line dividing the axis of the zodiac from in between Cancer and Leo, and in between Capricorn and Aquarius, the signs Leo, Virgo, Libra, Scorpio, Sag, and Capricorn would all be referred to as solar signs, or the solar hemisphere of the zodiac. And conversely, we have the lunar signs, or the lunar half of the zodiac, from Aquarius through Cancer. And in this way, we see that the solar mutable signs are Virgo and Sag, and that in some way they retain that illumination or the accuracy that is somehow lost and brought into the dark with the lunar half of the zodiac here, with the signs Gemini and Pisces. So I thought that was an interesting way where we actually see this concept extended further through the principle of the solar and lunar signs as well.
Exactly. It's so fascinating.
Hmm.
And we have these modal patterns also, in other signs too.
Hmm.
Um, are we gonna take a look at the fixed signs next?
Yeah.
Okay. The fixed signs also have a very, very fascinating alignment with them.
So when we're looking at okay, we've already talked a lot about the different trigons in the zodiac, the different hexagons, the different wedges and minor grand trines, and all these amazing ways we can look at how the signs connect. And one of the really principal ways, through the modalities or the quadruplicities, or through the aspect lens, we're looking at grand crosses. So groups of 4 signs that are in oppositions, which we did explore one, then we just explored the mutable cross, um, which is unique because it retains this symmetrical alignment with the domiciles of the luminaries versus Venus and Mars. So that's interesting on its own. But now we explore the other 2 modalities of the 4 cardinal signs and the 4 fixed signs, where we find even more amazing patterns here. So with the fixed signs, for instance, the 4 domicile lords are the Sun, Saturn in Aqua and Leo, and then the other 2 fixed signs are Taurus and Scorpio, where we have Venus and Mars. So obviously we know that the remaining planets besides Mercury and Jupiter are responsible for all of the fixed and cardinal signs, because Mercury and Jupiter only rule mutable, and the other 2 modalities are all the other planets. So with this, we see the Sun in Leo and Saturn in Aquarius squaring Venus in Taurus and Mars in Scorpio. And we've already talked about all of those placements as significant, because these 4 signs contain these 4 remaining planets in their preferred domiciles, versus the cardinal signs, where we see the moon in Cancer opposing Saturn in Capricorn, where it's not rejoicing by sign gender, squaring Mars in Aries and Venus in Libra, which are also both not rejoicing by their sign gender.
Yes. Yeah, and so that's super significant with the fixed signs, because what is fixed energy all about? Maintaining what is working, maintaining what is comfortable, like doing what you know will work. And that is something that is so apparent with the elemental, and not just the elemental, but the dignity scheme. Not And that is something that is so apparent with the modality of the fixed signs. To
Mhm,
have the planets' preferred domiciles all configured to each other, being fixed energy, it makes perfect sense. They're not as exploratory
mhm,
as even cardinal or mutable signs, you know?
mhm.
And there's nothing wrong with that. You know, like you can chase the sun forever and you will never ever have the horizon in your hands, you know? So that fixed energy can follow through, that can hamper that just like in unfaltered, like voracious consumption of knowledge that comes with mutable signs too. It
Mhm,
can help a cardinal sign complete its journey. And that is something that is so, I think, very beautiful
mhm.
about the fixed signs is that they are very nice and like it's just
Their
comfortable.
stability is beautiful, like,
Yeah,
energetically, the resonance that those 4 signs hold, um, on so many different levels, some of which we'll discuss next week when we talk about all about Antisha and Contra Antisha.
yes,
Um, but in this case, with the 4 cardinal signs versus the 4 fixed signs, the 4 cardinal signs are in some sense all like stepping out of their comfort zone. All of the planets are in some way not like configured or situated in the most comfortable environment. And so when we think about the seasons, all of those cardinal seasons are initiating the complete end, like that the end has happened by then of the previous season. And so the cardinal has to shake up nature to reinvigorate it with a new energy that it can then situate and become comfortable with in the fixed season or in the fixed sign. So that heat of springtime that comes with Mars and Aries finally tempers and settles with Venus and Taurus, you know, and then now, for instance, we just entered Gemini season, this mercurial time where we're really amping up to summertime. It's like finally oscillating just enough to get the light for the moon in Cancer to take over, which is officially, you know, going to end the spring season and bring on summertime in its fullness.
this is a little bit of a digression, but the sun entered Gemini the day that that happened. It hit 100 degrees in my city for the first time
Wow.
this year. It was 100, hit the triple digits, and it was the day the sun entered Gemini.
Of course. Wouldn't
Uh-huh,
expect it
of
any less.
course.
I know.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
I also just loved that ingress because I was like, oh my God, like we're Antisha to Cancer now. Like we're finally reaching the top of the wheel, like the most amount of light of the year. So I was just like, oh, finally. Because I love that time of year, of course. So yeah, I mean, these were some of the, you know, discoveries that we were kind of chatting back and forth about, this idea of comfortability with the fixed signs and then this stepping into something unknown with the cardinal signs. It's kind of like this brazen confidence that cardinal energy kind of exhibits, like even in a fake way, where sometimes I feel like this is super generalized, but that generally cardinal energy could be like a little bit more like um superficial or like just like fake in a way, like just I'm being super general, whereas like someone with a lot of fixed energy is like just very present and like they're very themselves with you. So there's something about that fixed nature just bringing you into presence like in your body, whereas that cardinal nature is like you're going off, you're getting into your mind about something, or it's like it seems like there's this deviance or diversion from you know, just being present in your body, that somehow that fixed principle retains, you know, energetically here with all the different four fixed signs.
Yes, 100%. I know numerous Scorpio moon and rising sign people. I have never met anybody as unapologetically them, honestly. Like, it's very, very much like I am who I am. I do not give a fuck. Like, if I
Mhm,
don't like you, I do not like you. I do not feel obligated to keep that to myself. I don't
mhm,
want to talk to you. I don't really want to be around you. And that's something that I have seen in a lot of like really, really prominent like Scorpios. I don't know very many like super prominent like Tauruses or Leos, but yeah, very, very unapologetic when it comes
mhm.
to being themselves, and I think that that's a great thing.
Yeah.
And then looking at the cardinal signs, we have all of the planets in their non-preferred domicile, except for the moon in
Yeah, I wanted to
Cancer.
talk about this.
So we have Mars for the cardinal signs, starting with Aries. We have Mars as a diurnal planet, a nocturnal planet in a diurnal sign, and then we have the Moon as a nocturnal planet in a nocturnal sign. We've got Libra, nocturnal planet, diurnal sign, and then we have Saturn, diurnal planet in a nocturnal sign of Capricorn. And so I think that that also speaks to the cardinal energy in the sense that it is always trying to change things. There might be just a little bit of discomfort, that comes with that just inherently because of the scheme. And that might be why they want to change things. That might be why they're motivated to do otherwise, to open all of these books, and why they don't really care to close them. And yeah, I think that it's really significant that the moon is the most comfortable
Mm,
of all of this because it's commonly associated where cardinal energy is masculine. But here we see that the most situated of all of the cardinal signs is Cancer. Cancer is Sat. Cancer is the most comfortable cardinal sign by far.
yeah, I mean, there's definitely different arguments, like maybe for Saturn in Capricorn, but like, and even Mars in Aries. I mean, you can make arguments for any of them, but like principally, the moon is the only one that's rejoicing by sign gender. So if there's something yelling at us to say, like, pay attention, look at this, right? And so, as we were saying, how the cardinal signs initiate that change, the moon is all about change, generation, and corruption, right? And so, having the lunar archetype highlighted in the cardinal signs, I think speaks to somehow the lunar principle, or like the principle of fortune and chance and change, gestation and destruction, somehow is built into that idea of cardinal energy where, if you're building up on something, it's because something just died right before it, because that cardinal step of the sequence from cardinal fixed to mutable, cardinal fixed to mutable, it is the birth after the transitory phase in between life and death. And so the moon, I think, speaks to that as an archetype, whereas we have the sun, which speaks to the nature of fixed energy. It speaks to the constant solar principle of life to thrive and to prevail. Eventually life prevails always. And so I think the sun, as kind of the counterpart to the moon, which is kind of highlighted in the cardinal signs, the sun is sort of a co-partner in having like a primary um, sympathy to this fixed nature, whereas the moon has it in this cardinal sense.
Right. The luminaries are incredibly powerful. And because the moon has extra power with the cardinal signs, I mean, because Cancer has extra power with the cardinal signs, um, the sun, it makes perfect sense that the sun would also have like a degree of additional power over the other signs.
Hmm.
And when you think about like the sun and seasons and the nature of a fixed sign, it makes a lot of sense. The sun, we've learned today, like, well, not today, but we've learned with science that the sun is the only thing that is not rotating around Earth, like in any way, shape, or form. And like things aren't orbiting around our planet, but things are still orbiting. The sun, from it within our solar system, is not moving very much, like if at all. It's moving, our whole solar system is moving through space, but the sun itself is stable. It's that foundation, it's that fixed like base of life,
Hmm.
period.
Yeah, like when you want to talk about the wheel of fortune, right? Like there's a center point that isn't moving, where everything else is moving around it. The sun retains that archetypal quality that it holds everything together. So the first thing I want to just mention really quickly, when we're looking at the elements, is that each trigon is assigned a benefic, a malefic, and a luminary, or in the cases of the earth and air signs, Mercury, or the neutral planet. So this is interesting because we're automatically set up with the distinction between the elements of fire and water, which are assigned a luminary, versus earth and air, which are assigned Mercury. And we can also see, sorry, did you want to say something, Stella?
No, I'm agreeing with you.
Yeah, and so we can see that the benefic and malefic planets of the fire and water trigons are Mars and Jupiter. And if you have a day chart those are the extremely most beneficial, so Jupiter, and most malefic planets, which is Mars. And then
Mhm.
for the Earth and air signs, we see the most benefic planet as Venus and the most malefic planet as Saturn. So there's this distinction between the fire and water signs, which are assigned the true luminaries and also are associated with the solar principle in a way, because the distinction we have between those two planets, they're, the most positive and most negative for a day chart, versus the earth and air signs where we have Mercury. So we have a lack of the luminaries assignment. And then also we have the polarities of the extreme planets for a nocturnal sect chart or a night chart. So, as some of you guys may have seen from Twitter, we put this diagram together to kind of explain a little bit about some of the unique things that aren't really emphasized when looking at the triplicities or the elements. But we feel like they're relevant to talk about because they add a really interesting interpretation to understanding like where different like influences or lacking of influence might be coming from with each element. Um, so Stella, do you want to talk a little bit about with each trigon, which planet is like lacking in a way or being not
Yeah.
rejoicing?
Yeah, so with this diagram we have on the top here the planets that are not rejoicing within each element. And that will give you a bit of an insight into the nature of the element, you know? So we've got Mars as the malefic out of that's kind of out of place. Yeah, and it's very fascinating because the planets that relate with sect, as you were saying, they do not relate to the gender of the sign, you know? Like, we don't have, like, if we're gonna use gender and like diurnal versus nocturnal, like synonymously with masculine and feminine when defining
Mm,
the signs, you can see that the masculine signs are fire and air, but the feminine signs are earth and water. And we get this inconsistency here. And it's really fascinating because when you the sign out of place is the planet that does not belong to that sect, right? So we have Mars in the masculine diurnal sign of Aries. Mars is out of place because Mars is a nocturnal planet. When we go into water, we have Jupiter as the diurnal planet in the nocturnal sign of Pisces. When you contrast that with the other water signs, those are both nocturnal planets in nocturnal signs. That carries through with the Earth, where we have Saturn in Capricorn as a diurnal planet in a nocturnal sign, and then air, Venus is a nocturnal planet in the diurnal sign of Libra. And this really speaks on the energies of the zodiac. And I think it's really funny because you'll see like stereotypical posts that are really generalizable, like on social media or whatever, where it's like, oh, like fire signs are crazy, like they're the troublemakers, like blah, 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 blah. And that has a lot to do with the fact that trigonally, like as an element, Mars is the malefic that is also out of place. And
mhm,
so there's that degree of abrasiveness. When we go into water, we have Jupiter and Pisces. Everybody says that water signs are just dreamers. They're not, they're emotional, like
mhm,
led by their hearts. And that's really encapsulated with that out of place planet and sign.
mhm,
Earth signs are often referred to as being too rigid, Debbie Downers, you
mhm,
know, but then we have that Saturn in Capricorn. And
mhm,
then with air signs are often referred to as aloof, and they might be daydreamers
mhm,
versus like longing dreamers that come with like water signs. They're very mentally active a lot of the time. They can be perceived as very superficial. And I feel like that is described very well by the out of place Venus in Libra.
mhm. Yeah, I mean, I feel like there's so many interesting connections that we can keep finding here. I love everything you said in the way where we see how, fire and earth are getting this lack from a malefic energy, but then water and air are getting this lack from the benefic energy. And it's interesting to see how, they both play out in, a negative way, but it's stemming from a different influence. And, in these cases, water and air are suffering from that out of place benefic energy, but fire and earth from the out of place malefic energy. And or what were you going to say?
And well, it's interesting because the malefics, you kind of want them to be hampered, you know? Like
Mm,
you want them to be in something that's going to tone them down a little bit.
mhm,
And with the benefics, you want them to be amplified. You want them to be in signs where they can be raised up. And
mm,
this doesn't quite happen here, you know? The malefics are not really being hampered. They are not, and the benefics are not being raised up. They're
mm,
both kind of in this moderate state where there's no like polarity of like extreme good or extreme bad.
mhm. Yeah. And I think the other unique division, and I mean, this would give us all three ways to divide them in half. When we look at water and earth signs uniquely, the out of place planets are the diurnal planets, Jupiter and Saturn, versus the fire and air signs, which have a nocturnal planet out of place. And I know now this is going to get confusing because we've looked at the grouping of like fire and water versus earth and air, and fire and earth versus water and air, and now water and earth versus fire and air. But like these unique nuances in the planetary energies are all written in there. And that's what makes every element so unique, because they're all composed of completely different, unique arrangements of these energies that just add so much nuance to the expression and what makes them their own energy, really.
And they're not super explicit, you know? Like these are
Mhm.
kind of covertly like woven
Right.
into the scheme.
Right.
And so it might not be like the most in your face aspect of the zodiac, but
Mhm,
it is extremely fundamental.
mhm,
Like there is a very, very purposeful basis
right,
to what is going on here. And especially just with the out of place planet, like you can see that so clearly in like the air archetype and the earth archetype, you know?
mhm, right.
Yeah. Was there anything else?
I don't think so.
Yeah, we
Maybe
don't
unless
even.
we wanna just amplify saying that fire is supported by luminary and benefic energy, and water is supported by luminary and malefic. And the other things, we can always look at which planets are rejoicing in each trigon by the gender. So for the fire signs, they're getting supported by that luminary and benefic energy. For the water signs, it's the support from the luminary and the malefic energy, so from the moon and Mars. For earth signs, they're getting support from the neutral, in this case Mercury and Venus. So we're getting a neutral benefic support. And then finally for the air signs, the support is coming from a neutral malefic energy, so Mercury and Gemini and Saturn and Aquarius.
Yeah, and like I feel like this again, I'm just going to emphasize like how well this describes like not just archetypes of elements, but stereotypes that you see. Like
Mm.
those silly little posts, like all perfectly
Coincide these little
encapsulate.
specific codes in the arrangement
Uh-huh.
of the planetary rulerships in each element. And oh,
Exactly.
and
And
the other,
what's
sorry, you go.
and we're getting
You both
excited.
go. Sorry, sorry.
I know. And what's so crazy is that like a lot of these pop astrology accounts have no fucking clue like about
Right,
this stuff. Like I'm not gonna say all of them, but like I don't know. I've really never seen anyone talk about this distinction here. I'm
right.
not
It
gonna say
just
that nobody has,
Yeah.
but yeah,
It just speaks to the fractal nature. It's like the codes are all written there. Like people can grasp onto what fire means in a different way and make a meme about it, but we can always still find that there's this root cause of what drives that. And
exactly.
the other amazing thing that stems from this is there is an argument to think about the assignment of the Dorothean triplicity lords, which are the most common assignments of triplicity rulerships. Because when we look at fire and air signs, the planets that rejoice for fire signs are Sun and Jupiter, and those are the primary and secondary triplicity rulers for fire. Same thing with air. We get Mercury and Saturn, which are the primary and secondary triplicity rulers for fire. And, I'm sorry, for primary and then secondary. So for diurnal and then nocturnal. And that's consistent because we ordered this table in a reason. We kept the luminaries and the neutrals together, and then we put either the malefic or the benefic below it. So what we see here is there's a retainment in the structure between it going Sun, Jupiter, and then Mercury, Saturn. Now I know this doesn't hold up for the water and earth signs, but it's interesting to notice that there is a connection here between the Dorothean triplicity lords and also maybe a potential idea for how to maybe experiment with using other triplicity lords for each element. So that's just another seed to think about with this as well.
Uh-huh. Yeah, sit on that for a little bit because I know that that's a big thing to be
Yeah,
like, oh, like question the triplicities,
I
but like
know.
question them because
I
like
know.
look at this beautiful symmetry that we have. There
I will
is.
say that, like, of course, the triplicity lords that come from the scheme of the planetary joys, like, it makes sense if you read about why they're signed the way they are.
Yes,
But
and we
this
will
is
be
cool.
talking about that.
Yes,
We
yeah,
will
I
be
know.
talking about that very, very soon.
Yeah,
I'm really glad that we had such a fruitful discussion today. This was
yeah.
a
We
great,
talked
like,
about a
really fun.
lot.
Yeah. Let us know what you thought in the comments.
Mhm,
If you have any questions for us, please let
mhm.
us know. I know that this was a big bite of an episode,
Yeah.
but I hope that everybody enjoyed it.
Mhm,
Don't forget to like, subscribe. Once again, let us know what you thought in the comments. If you have any requests, let
mhm.
us know. Yeah, any last words?
Just keep your belts buckled for next week when we get into Antisha, because we have all of this and so much more to talk about, and then how Antisha is going to connect with the minor dignities like the Dodecatemoria, and like just please stay tuned if you're still listening. We're so excited for what's going to be happening. And next week we're going to be at Norwalk, so we're going to be recording that one together, which is super exciting. Finally, the
Yes.
Mercuranians will be united. Um,
Mhm.
but also just expecting any maybe potential delays, or because we're going to be traveling, and so we're not totally sure when it will come out, but we will have it up eventually. So
Yes, yes. Stay tuned.
mhm,
Once again, thank you guys for watching.
yeah, thank you guys.
If you felt a little bit like lost with this one, I might like ask like if you watched our Zodiac episode before this, where we kind of set the stage for a lot of what we talked about.
Mhm.
But if you did feel kind of confused, then there's always that to go back to, and I feel like that would really piece in a lot of the maybe holes that may or may not be there. But regardless, happy stargazing,
Happy
everybody.
stargazing, and
Yes,
Mercuranians out.
Mercurians out.
All right, bye guys, thank you. See you soon.